Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live broadcast, Adaptive Process Design, Automation, and Analytics in Laboratory R&D, presented by Tim Gardner. I'm Susie Valdez of LabRoots, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We are excited to bring you this educational web seminar presented by LabRoots, the leading scientific social networking website and provider of virtual events and webinars advancing scientific collaboration and learning. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that this presentation is interactive. We want to hear from you, so questions, comments, and even answers can be submitted via the green Q&A button at the lower left of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone, but if not, we will make sure to follow up with you by email. You can also enlarge the slide window by clicking on the screen icon in the lower right-hand corner of your slide window. If you cannot hear or see this presentation properly, let us know by clicking on the support button at the top right or the Q&A button at the lower left. I will now turn the presentation over to our fabulous presenter, Tim Gardner. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to present today. I'm looking forward to telling you about Riffyn and how we're addressing some of the most difficult problems in scientific experimentation and data analytics in modern R&D laboratories. Riffyn is a 3-year-old company based in Oakland, California, and we offer a cloud-based platform for collaborative process design and integrative data analytics of scientific experiments in R&D organizations. Our roots are actually in the R&D of industrial bioprocesses, from DNA engineering and strain engineering and cell line development all the way through scale-up and tech transfer of these technologies to full-scale manufacturing. And those roots have translated into an architecture for Riffyn's capabilities that we hope really resonates with scientists in the lab and data scientists as well, and analysts of in charge of new product development for industrial sectors in the food, in the biopharmaceutical, in the biotech, and the materials and chemical industries. So let me begin with an outline of some of the pain points that we have heard from the marketplace, from people in the laboratories, and how we've distilled them in sort of a slightly humorous view of the world as it is now. First of all, we hear this. People are frustrated with electronic lab notebooks, or as we summarize it, electronic lab notebooks are where your data goes to die. We also hear about LIMS and frustrations with LIMS, or as we like to say, LIMS solving yesterday's problem tomorrow or the day after. And spreadsheets, the worst data management solution ever, except for all the others. What this summarizes to, for many people, is a sort of resignation that the data solutions for R&D will always be suboptimal and will never quite rise to solving the kinds of analytical and analytical challenges that they want to apply to resolve hypotheses. Riffyn doesn't believe it has to be the case. And to get to a solution, we looked across many different fields of human endeavor and realized something fundamental, that every field of human ingenuity begins with a blueprint, architectural diagrams for buildings, storyboards for film making, computer-aided design files for automobiles and airplanes. Basically everything you do in human ingenuity starts this way, except for science. In science, because of its perhaps empirical roots, people just go out into the lab, they sketch out an experimental design, and they go out in the lab and do it, and they collect data and then attempt to interpret that data. Oftentimes that data is collected in notebooks, spreadsheets, databases, many different flavors of data depending on how you collected it, that then becomes an unmanageable problem thereafter to try to synthesize. And we surveyed many dozens of companies in the marketplace over the years and heard common themes of frustration, such as our data is all over the place and our results end in a data graveyard. We can't determine which variables matter or which results are real. And we work on what we know, not what matters, we can't control our process variation. These distill down to three critical issues: spreadsheet hell, as we like to say, unlinkable data sets, and unrecorded methods. These are the core issues that Riflyn is resolving with its design and analysis platform. These problems, to put it into the framework of scientific experimentation and hypothesis testing, boils down to a clouding of the fundamental relationship that we're trying to resolve in any kind of scientific experiment, which is basically, if you really summarize it, is does variable X affect variable Z? That could be a process variable affecting a critical quality parameter. That could be a perturbation to a biological system affecting some outcome or physiological trait. Whatever it is, we're trying to find these correlations. In an ideal world, these correlations look like this, perfectly lined up, one variable affecting the other. But the reality is that with all of our errors and measurement issues, those relationships are much less clear. The same data with noise looks like this. The relationship perhaps still being there, but harder to detect because of the noise. Or even worse, if you've underpowered those experiments because you haven't set up a proper experimental design with sufficient statistical power, or because the data you've collected from different experiments are not combinable because of various day-to-day or week-to-week issues in measurement or inability to integrate data sets, you don't have the power to detect that relationship at all. Or in the worst case scenario, the data are stored in different databases and systems without the joining and linking information to ask the question if two variables are correlated. These problems are endemic throughout the different fields of science, and they're very similar no matter what field or what aspect of the product life cycle you work on. But the good news is that we've seen this problem before, and we've also seen its solution. Looking back through history, we see that in automobile manufacturing and many fields of manufacturing, they went through a revolution from the 1960s through the 1980s, or at least some companies did. And that revolution was the implementation of total quality practices. When Japanese auto manufacturers adopted and implemented these practices, they saw their productivity in production of vehicles triple or even quadruple over a 20-year period, while companies that didn't apply them, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, saw no improvement in productivity. What this boils down to is the realization that if every other car you produce is a lemon or defective in some way, and you have to throw it out, then half of your industrial capacity is going to waste. When you get quality, it's not just about making customers happy, which is obviously a good outcome. It's about not wasting resources on unproductive endpoints. And in the scientific world, we don't necessarily realize this, but we're experiencing the same kind of waste because many, many, many of our experiments are devoted to unproductive outcomes, questions that don't resolve because there's too much noise, or time spent on artifacts that turn out to be false. We apply sometimes euphemistic labels to that, call it regression to the mean, but that's nothing more than chasing an artifact that was a consequence of noise that once the noise dissipates, you see wasn't real in the first place. So at the bottom line, if we can take these lessons from manufacturing, which are now ubiquitous in the manufacturing world, and translate them to an R&D sector, we can actually see a dramatic improvement in productivity, meaning the pace with which we discover new information and build on it. And this is an example of exactly that kind of productivity benefit in my own experiences in a company developing engineered yeast. These yeasts were developed over a multi-year period. They were genetically engineered to produce a compound at high yields. And the goal of this project was to improve those yields through genetic engineering. In the early years, due to a lot of noise in the system, we would see rare, large jumps in performance with a lot of plateaus and flatlining in between. And at some point along the way, we started to get concerned that we would never emerge from those flat lines. And we introduced a quality program which reduced the error in measurement by 6-fold. What that did is make the lots of little improvements that normally would go undetected because they were below the noise threshold, it made those improvements detectable and reproducible. And when you can find those improvements and then build on them quickly, you've got an overall doubling in the pace of discovery and development of those strains. And the key to that is being able to not only detect those results, but trust them and to stack that knowledge quickly. And that's a metaphor for science as a whole, which is now a global enterprise across many dozens of people collaborating on a typical project, or thousands of people collaborating on industrial development programs who need to share and build on each other's work. So what are these lessons of manufacturing quality that have been successfully also applied in a biotech setting, and how can they be applied more broadly? That's really the foundation of what Riffyn sought to address and to embed into its software capabilities. They're actually quite simple, and they're quite well known. They start with design, the idea that if you want to have a trustworthy result, you have to be very explicit about how are you going to deliver that result. What is the process or technology or method you're going to use to achieve that outcome. Then you measure whether you're actually delivering on the design specification and analyze that data to look for deviations from expectation and ways to improve it. Once you make those improvements, you share the results and iterate, cycling back to the design to improve on the design. And it's a continuous process. It's often called continuous improvement. But what that really means is design your system, measure its performance, analyze it for improvement opportunities, and then update your organization to work better. The problem is that these methods, which are commonly applied in manufacturing, are often hard to apply in R&D because R&D is constantly changing. It's so flexible. There's so many different data modalities, hard to bring that together. So what Riffyn has done is created a cloud-based collaborative software platform that embeds these principles into its architecture and is completely adaptive, meaning as you change your experimental or research processes on an hourly basis even, the entire system updates itself and adapts to those changes so that you can continue to collect data and apply the principles of quality. In essence, it boils down to those 4 phases. A design capability, which allows you to specify without ambiguity the experimental methods and processes you use. It then uses those experimental processes to provide automated context to your data as you acquire it in real time. And that allows you to endow your data with meaning without having to write down a lot of information repetitively. That data is then linked together using, again, the process design as the guide for how to join data sets together so that the whole analytical pipeline, or what in many organizations is called an ETL layer or extract transform layer, is automated. And the outcome is a data table that's fully structured and ready for statistical analysis with just a click of the button. And finally, all of this is built into a real-time collaborative sharing platform akin to Google Docs, where anything you do in your web browser in Riffyn is instantly reflected to anybody else's browser who's looking at that same information. So when you apply these principles the way that Riffyn has developed, you start with an environment of data collection and experiments that looks a lot like this: manual back records and spreadsheets for collecting data, spread out across experiments and people and different modalities, and transforming it to this, which is Riffyn providing a graphical view of experimental processes with full sample tracking, collection of all specifications, settings, parameter settings, and actual data into one place, organized so that with just a couple clicks you can get to correlative analytics, as shown in the bottom, to understand the relationship between properties of your process and your biological or chemical system and how they affect outcomes in your product or your physiological traits. And now I'm going to walk you briefly through the different aspects of Riffyn in a little bit more detail. As mentioned before, it's this 4-part design, measure, analyze, and share cycle. And we're going to start with outlining how Riflyn works in the design. So this is a view of an HPLC process defined in Riflyn, with each of these boxes being a step or group of steps in the execution of your HPLC method. Everything from equilibration to sample injection to analysis. And the left side of each box is the inputs to that step, and the right side is the outputs. So Riflyn organizes experiments into a series of linked input-output transformations, where the links between them are the materials and equipment flowing from step to step. Down in the bottom, you see the explicit definition of those equipment and materials, all of which come from a controlled vocabulary, which I'll show in a little bit, including their specifications and units, which can be used to augment and provide the metadata to understand the data that's actually collected. Everything in Riflyn is version controlled, like source code and branchable, and you can use those different versions to execute experiments. Each version still being a live and executable version, so you can have multiple experiments on different versions of your process. And you can augment with video and pictures and text and Facebook-like feeds of comments as you develop the process. Each process in design mode becomes a template for execution of experiments. And when you execute those experiments, you're going to collect data from the laboratory. So Riflyn provides the facilities to collect data from virtually any modality that you would get it in the lab, from manual data collection and batch records that you might typically keep in logbooks by hand, to acquiring data from databases, LIMS systems, ELN, data historians, or parsing directly the instrument software, the instrument files, the software data files that come out of instruments. All of this is collected, parsed, and sent through an encrypted channels to the Riflyn cloud, where the different data streams and the different variables in those data files are attached to the process design, to each property in the process, and contextualize on the fly so that you know what that data means as soon as it's collected. The raw data files are also archived, and then all that data can be accessed through Riflyn or through programmatic means, including a RESTful web API, CSV exports, which are ready for analysis in R or Spotfire or JUMP or any common analytical program, or streaming into data lakes. Each file that comes out, no matter what experiment that was collecting the data, comes out in the same generic structure. When you're designing these processes for experimentation, Riflyn harnesses a controlled vocabulary to ensure that terminology is consistent from experiment to experiment, from process to process, from group to group, and team to team. And what that does is not only make it easier to interpret what's happening, it also ensures that the data is mineable, so that when you're correlating categories of information with other variables in your system, you don't have to deal with 20 different versions of a name for the very same material or equipment. This controlled vocabulary currently includes about 80,000 terms, and it's dynamically customizable, as you can see at the bottom of that autocomplete list. You can add new terms, you can reorganize them. In addition to controlled vocabularies, Riflyn provides sample and inventory registration and assignment of those materials to experiments. In this view, you're seeing a listing of different animals that are in this organization's inventory and the properties of those animals listed in the upper right pane, including the last recorded values, such as the mass of that animal in a previous experiment. When you want to use an animal or a piece of equipment or a sample, you can directly assign it to the experimental run or experimental sample or the experimental execution instance for that process. So what you see in the bottom is a list of 6 different runs, each of which is using a different animal, whether it's diabetic or not, and the identity of the animal assigned and all of its properties. So you don't have to re-enter all this information because it's taken from the inventory system. Even more importantly, Riflyn tracks the propagation of samples and inventory equipment from step to step across your process. So as you are, for example, here going from the formulation of a treatment in the formulation step to the injection of those treatments, those solutions into these animals, Riffyn is tracking the different animals that are being treated in the second step, step 4, the dosing and feeding, and the source of the material in the prior step, which is the formulation step. And you can simply select a sample in any step and see what its parent or child was. This tracking of samples in a direct way facilitates the analytical capability, because Riffyn's analytics engine then traces all of those parent-child relationships across equipment and material flow and is able to connect and link the data that you collect on one step or one sample with the data in its downstream steps and downstream samples. What that allows you to do is using a combination of the specifications that are provided from the design and this traceability, identify when things are out of control or abnormal, and then instantly identify root causes by looking upstream at the materials that are flowing into a step and what might be driving the expected or unexpected variation. This could be a good thing in the sense that you are perturbing your system intentionally and looking to see what perturbations drive variation and deviation, or it could be a bad thing because you're trying to deliver quality and you don't want deviation. In either case, you can harness the power of statistical multivariate analysis to answer these questions. And then Riffyn is also providing visualization capabilities, as illustrated here, which allow you to take a look at all of your samples and then filter them dynamically to understand whether those samples are exceeding some threshold, for example, for propagation to the next stage of your experiment. So if you're doing cell line development, you want to find your best hits, and then you want to select those, identify them, and tag them. You can do that and then propagate those tags back to the experiment so that you can move those samples forward to the next stage. All of this, as I mentioned, is provided in a real-time collaborative framework. So every process, every experiment, every sample is shareable through an interface akin to, as I said, Google Docs or Dropbox or Box, where you can simply type in the email address of your collaborator, set their administrative level. They could be an administrator, a designer, an operator, or a viewer, and control whether they're allowed to share this information with other people. And then once you've done that, this process and all of the experiments and data you've collected, all of the versions of it, are accessible by that collaborator. And if you give them the permissions, they're also allowed to edit and improve on that process. So in summary, Riffyn has been designed to synthesize all the elements that are commonly required to complete successful and data-driven experimental processes in the lab. It resolves the data structuring and contextualization problem, otherwise known as spreadsheet hell. And it does that in a flexible, dynamic way that allows you to design processes and modify them on the fly, but still continue to collect and structure data. It allows you to automate the data integration across every kind of instrument, from HPLCs to hand-collected data to spectrophotometers, plate reader files, limb systems, historians, and automatically join all of that information into a statistical data table for analysis. And it provides the ability to continuously evolve and update your work through the version control system, which facilitates the product life cycle as these processes go from early stage discovery all the way towards clinical trials and manufacturing. That history and record of its evolution becomes transparent. And of course, it's shareable, so you can easily transfer information between collaborating groups, which helps to resolve the ambiguity typically endemic to tech transfer. Riffyn really sees this. There is an opportunity in process-based research in life sciences and chemistry to adopt some of the practices that we see in discrete industries, namely the ideas of continuous improvement and rapid prototyping. In a discrete world, you can create a computer-aided design file and send it off to a manufacturing facility for prototyping in a very short period of time and then iterate. And we see an opportunity to do the same thing in process-based industries using the digital medium of process design and capabilities of the cloud to facilitate this idea of rapid prototyping and continuous improvement. And for that, you need a two-way sharing of manufacturing data and R&D data between the two sides of the product lifecycle. Riflyn is there to support all of these, for example, in biologics development, from discovery research to cell line and process development, process transfer and quality assurance. All of the, or nearly all of the needs of those different aspects of the product lifecycle are accessible through Riflyn. And so to conclude, I'll leave you with one final thought about data integration and data silos, which I think is perfectly captured in this cartoon. And I will conclude my remarks and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Tim. We want to get right to the questions and input. So here's a reminder as to how audience members can communicate with us. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A button at the lower left. If we are unable to get to your questions due to a time constraint, Tim will go ahead and reach out to you via email. So let's take our first question. It looks like an audience member would like to know, is Rifyn an ELN or a LIMS?
A limb system. Rifyn is both and neither. ELNs and limb systems are sort of the traditional technologies for what people like to say managing laboratory data. We really try to avoid the word manage in Riflyn altogether because managing data speaks of putting it to death, tucking it away in a corner so you're not bothered by it. The whole point of data is to put it to work, and Riflyn is architected to deliver analytical capability and to do all the things you need with experimental design and data organization and structuring to facilitate analytics. So Riflyn can work with limb systems. We can pull data from limb systems in real time. We can pull data from ELN systems. We can push data to those systems. So if you wanted to continue to use those systems in your laboratory, that would be fine. And we can still deliver the analytical value on top of that. But at the same time, if you wanted to dispense with those systems, because Riflyn is both flexible like an ELN and structured like a LIMS, we can actually become a primary data collection system as well. So you can use it in a hybrid mode where some parts of your organization are using Riflyn kind of like a LIMS, and others are using it as an analytical engine. Or even one experiment could have elements of both.
Great. I think you actually answered this next audience question, which was, do I have to then get rid of my ELN or LIMS system to use Riflyn?
Yes, right. I did. You do not, and we can work in harmony with existing systems or provide them if you don't have any to begin with.
Can Riflyn connect to instruments?
Yes. The primary mechanism for connecting to instrument data, there's a couple. One is a lot of instruments produce flat files as output. But those flat files need to be interpreted. And Riflyn provides a mechanism to parse instrument data files and place the parsed data into Riflyn. So that parsing capability is entirely configurable on the fly by scientists and savable to the processes. The other mechanism is a data agent, which facilitates direct real-time connectivity to databases and instruments. It has a plug-in architecture. So certainly Riflyn is a young company. We don't have the drivers for every instrument out there, but should your organization want a direct connection, it's possible to create a driver that provides it, or to ingest data through flat files or through databases connections. And we do provide out-of-the-box connections for databases. There is also a RESTful API, which allows you to push and pull, read and write data to and from Riflyn directly to the core data model. So any of those routes become a means by which you can integrate with this instruments.
Wonderful. We have a lot of great questions coming in. Something very similar, an audience member would like to know, can I use R, Python, SAS, JMP, Tableau, Spotfire, or other analytical packages with Riflyn?
Yeah, Riflyn is designed under the assumption that no matter how much we build into it, there will always be analyses that you want to do that Riflyn doesn't do. And the last thing we'd ever want to do is lock your data up. So we provide every mechanism we possibly can for you to get your data out in a statistical and data mineable form as easily as possible. And what that means is you can have direct queries and connections from R, JMP, Spotfire, any of those systems can pull data out directly from Riflyn, ready for analysis and immediately visualize it. Or you could stream it into analytical pipelines, or as I mentioned, data lakes, which we're doing for some customers.
And Tim, will Riflyn support inventory and sample tracking?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, Riflyn does provide sample registration of biologic material, chemical material. It also types those so that you know that a compound is a different physical entity than a piece of equipment. So we have an ontology of over 80,000 different material and equipment and chemical types built in, which, as I mentioned, is extensible. So not only do we register samples in biological entities and chemical entities and equipment, but we also type them, and we also keep track of all of the recorded data that is associated with those entities.
Awesome. Thank you. And I think that answers this next question, which was, what if my process keeps changing? Do I lose that past data?
Well, yeah, it's a slightly different question. So as I mentioned, Riflyn has version control, and as you improve your processes and change them, all of the past experiments that were run on past versions remain associated with those past versions. Yet when you export your data, it will compile all of the data and all of the parameters and all of the variants of your processes and your experimental results into a single contiguous data file. So you can then ask questions of correlation. When I change this parameter, how did that impact the outcomes that I saw? And you can ask that question across months and months of data, even as the process changes.
Great. We have so many great questions. We have a couple more minutes to answer a few more. What sort of research can Riflyn support?
Well, Riflyn's designed for process-based industries. So very broadly, anything that is recipe-driven, meaning you have material inputs, you apply some transformation, heat or pressure or biological reaction, enzyme treatments, fermentations, just simply movement, any transformation of those inputs to physical output or even non-physical inputs and outputs is modelable within Riflyn's Process Designer. So we currently are supporting customers in food industries, in biopharmaceutical process development, cell line development, analytical chemistry, industrial biotechnology, enzyme development, fermentation processes. All of those processes are currently represented and supported in Riflyn at our customers, and even animal studies. We have processes for animal studies that we have developed. Thank you.
We have time for one more. An audience member would like to know, how secure is Riflyn?
Riflyn is the very first thing we asked when we started building Riflyn, is how to make this as secure as we possibly can with the most cutting-edge technologies. Why? Because we realize that research and development data is the most precious asset for innovation-driven organizations. And so we begin with confidentiality. Any data that Riflyn holds is under a signed confidentiality agreement between Riflyn and that company or that customer, so that there's no sharing of data with any third party by legal obligation. Secondly, we've implemented the latest and most cutting-edge security encryption technologies. We have end-to-end encryption of all data at rest, from the database to the inter-process communication within the cloud all the way to the customer endpoint browser or data file. It's fully encrypted. It uses 2048-bit AES encryption technology. In addition, we have 14x redundancy on our data backups, meaning there's first 3 times real-time failover protection on your data. It's copied to a 4th real-time backup. That backup is snapshotted every 6 hours and reflected across 5 continents in 10 copies, so that there's really no possibility of losing your data due to a disaster. And finally, we adopt the best practices in the security industry, from penetration testing to OWASP programming standards to other international standards for coding and software development lifecycle and cloud-based security.
Tim Gardner, thank you so much for your very informative presentation. Do you have any final comments for the audience?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity to share our vision.
Thank you so much. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank LabRoots for making today's educational webcast possible. Today's webcast will be available for on-demand until August 2017. Keep an eye out for an email from LabRoots alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay. We encourage you to forward that announcement to your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you again next time. Goodbye.